Hi, I'm Sarah Chen. I'm 32 years old, and 3 months ago I did something that would make my Korean grandmother roll over in her grave. I sat through another one of Patricia Williams' lectures about how my kimchi fried rice was too exotic for Sunday dinner, nodding politely while she suggested I stick to casseroles like a normal wife should. What she didn't know was that morning, I'd signed the papers to buy her house right out from under her. The same house she'd been secretly trying to keep from foreclosure. The same house she'd lived in for 28 years. The same house where she'd spent every Sunday for the past 3 years telling me I wasn't good enough for her son. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But here's the thing about keeping secrets that big. They have a way of changing you from the inside out. Every smile becomes calculated. Every nod becomes strategic, and every single one of her criticisms starts to sound like the last gasps of someone who has no idea their world is about to shift completely. The Sunday that changed everything started like all the others. Michael was already dressed in his pressed khakis and polo shirt, the uniform of a man trying to keep peace at any cost. I stood in our kitchen in Riverside, California, staring at the glass containers lined up on our granite countertop. Bulgogi lettuce wraps, Korean corn cheese, and my grandmother's recipe for seafood pancakes that had taken me 4 years to perfect. Each dish was a small rebellion, wrapped in foil and hope. "Maybe we should just grab something from the store," Michael said, his voice carrying that familiar note of anxiety that appeared every Sunday morning. He was leaning against the doorframe, car keys already jangling in his hand like a nervous tick. "You know how she gets about the spice level." I turned to look at my husband of 4 years. Michael Williams was a good man, the kind who held doors and remembered anniversaries, and never once raised his voice during an argument. He was also the kind of man who had spent 34 years learning that the path of least resistance was the only path his mother approved of. His sandy brown hair was already showing premature gray at the temples, a feature I'd started noticing more frequently after our Sunday dinners became a weekly trial by fire. "She gets upset about everything I make, Michael," I said, sealing the last container. "Last week it was too salty. The week before that, too colorful. At some point you have to wonder if the problem isn't the food." He walked over and placed his hands on my shoulders, a gesture that once felt comforting but now felt more like restraint. "She's just set in her ways. You know how traditional she is." Traditional. That was the word we used instead of racist. The word we used instead of controlling. The word we used instead of acknowledging that Patricia Williams had decided on our wedding day that her son had made a mistake, and she'd been campaigning for a do-over ever since. I met Michael at a coffee shop near USC where I was finishing my marketing degree. He was getting his accounting certification and needed help with a presentation. I was the girl who color-coded her notes and always had extra pens. He was the guy who brought me lavender lattes and listened when I talked about wanting to start my own catering business someday. For 2 years, we existed in this perfect bubble where love felt simple and Sunday dinners were something other couples complained about. Then I met his mother. Patricia Williams was 58 years old and had the kind of presence that filled a room before she even spoke. She was tall, nearly 5'9", with silver hair that she kept in a perfect bob and clothes that looked like they'd been pressed that morning, regardless of the occasion. She spoke with the authority of someone who had taught 7th grade for 30 years and expected the world to raise its hand before offering an opinion. Our first meeting was at their family home on Oak Avenue, a sprawling ranch-style house with a wraparound porch and the kind of manicured lawn that required a sprinkler system and a gardener. Michael had warned me that his mother could be particular, but I'd assumed he meant she was neat or had strong opinions about politics. I'd brought homemade Korean pear salad and my brightest smile. "How interesting," she'd said, poking at the salad with her fork like it might bite back. "What exactly is in this?" I'd explained the ingredients enthusiastically, thinking her curiosity was genuine interest. Asian pear, cabbage, carrots, sesame oil, rice vinegar. Simple, fresh, nothing threatening. She'd nodded along, taking small bites and making little humming sounds that I'd mistaken for approval. "Well," she'd said finally, setting down her fork, "it's certainly different." I suppose Michael's been expanding his palate. The way she said it made it sound like a medical condition. That should have been my first clue. 3 years of Sunday dinners had taught me Patricia's language. Interesting meant wrong. Different meant unwelcome. Expanding his palate meant I was corrupting her son with my exotic ways. But the real education came in watching how she talked to Jessica, Michael's younger sister. Jessica Williams was everything I wasn't. Blonde where I was brunette, 5'5" where I was 5'3", and most importantly, she made the kind of food that appeared in church cookbooks and potluck dinners. Tuna casserole with crushed potato chips on top. Green bean casserole with the crispy onions. Jell-O salad with marshmallows and canned fruit. Patricia praised every dish like Jessica had just invented fire. "Oh, honey, this is divine," she'd gush, taking seconds and thirds of whatever Jessica brought. "You got this recipe from Grandma Williams, didn't you? She would be so proud to see you carrying on the family tradition." Family tradition. Another loaded phrase in the Williams household vocabulary. It meant white. It meant Midwestern. It meant not me. Jessica had started a food blog called Jessica's Kitchen Life the year before, documenting her journey through what she called classic American comfort food. Her Instagram account had grown to nearly 15,000 followers, who loved her aesthetic of mason jars and gingham napkins, and recipes that required exactly 3 ingredients. She'd even been featured in a local magazine as one of Riverside's rising culinary stars. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had a degree in marketing and had been cooking since I was 8 years old, but Jessica was the one getting the recognition. Not that anyone asked for my opinion about her blog or her recipes or her carefully curated feed that made every meal look like a Norman Rockwell painting. But here's what I learned about families like the Williams clan. They don't just want you to assimilate, they want you to disappear. They want you to become so much like them that there's nothing left of who you were before. And for 3 years, I'd been trying to do exactly that. I'd learned to make meatloaf. I'd mastered tuna casserole. I could whip up a green bean casserole that was indistinguishable from Patricia's own recipe. But every time I brought one of my grandmother's dishes, every time I tried to share a piece of my heritage, it was met with polite smiles and passive-aggressive comments about how adventurous I was being. The morning of that final Sunday dinner, I stood in my kitchen holding my grandmother's recipe card for seafood pancakes. The card was yellowed and soft from years of handling, written in her careful handwriting in both Korean and English. She'd taught me to make these pancakes when I was 10 years old, standing on a step stool in her tiny kitchen in Koreatown, her patient hands guiding mine as we mixed the batter. "Food is love, Sarah, yeah," she'd told me, using the Korean endearment that made me feel special and chosen. "When you feed someone, you give them a piece of your heart. Never let anyone make you ashamed of your heart." I'd been thinking about those words a lot lately, especially after the phone call I'd received from Aunt Rosa 3 days earlier. Rosa Martinez was my mother's younger sister, the one who'd become a real estate agent after her divorce, and had built a small empire buying and flipping houses in Southern California. She was 5'2" of pure determination, with graying black hair that she wore in a messy bun and the kind of confidence that came from closing deals with men who tried to dismiss her. "Mija," she'd said, her voice crackling through my phone. "I have news. Remember that house you pointed out to me? The one on Oak Avenue?" I'd remembered. I'd been driving past it for weeks, noticing the pre-foreclosure sign that had appeared in the front yard. It was Patricia's house, the house where Michael had grown up, the house where we'd spent every Sunday for 3 years, listening to lectures about proper seasoning and appropriate vegetables. "It's going to auction next week," Rosa had continued. "The owner's behind on payments. Way behind. You interested?" I should have said no. I should have told her it was crazy, that buying your mother-in-law's house was the kind of thing that destroyed families. But instead, I'd heard myself asking about the details. The minimum bid. The inspection report. The timeline. "Sarah," Rosa had said, and I could hear the grin in her voice. "You planning something I should know about?" I hadn't been planning anything. Not consciously. But as I'd hung up the phone and looked around my rental apartment with its beige walls and generic fixtures, I'd realized something had been building in me for months. A kind of quiet rage that had been simmering every time Patricia criticized my cooking, every time she praised Jessica's latest culinary creation, every time she made it clear that I was a guest in her son's life rather than a partner. The auction was scheduled for Tuesday morning. I'd called in sick to work and met Rosa at the courthouse steps, my hands shaking as I signed the paperwork. The minimum bid was $78,000. I'd been pre-approved for up to $120. There were only 3 other bidders. A developer looking for a flip property, an elderly couple downsizing from their current home, and me. The bidding started low and climbed steadily. $80,000. $90,000. $100,000. The developer dropped out at $105,000. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The elderly couple tapped out at $110,000. $115,000, I'd said, my voice stronger than my knees. Going once, going twice sold to bidder number 7. Just like that, I owned Patricia Williams' house. Rosa had hugged me so hard I thought my ribs might crack. "Micha, you just bought yourself some serious power," she'd whispered in my ear. "What are you going to do with it?" I hadn't known then. I had just known that for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could breathe all the way down to my toes. The paperwork took 2 weeks to finalize. 2 weeks of normal Sunday dinners where I smiled and nodded while Patricia explained why my Korean barbecue was too messy for a proper family meal. 2 weeks of watching Jessica post photos of her latest casserole creation with captions about quote, keeping family traditions alive. 2 weeks of Michael asking if I was feeling okay because I seemed different somehow. I was different. I was a homeowner. I was Patricia Williams' landlord, though she didn't know it yet. The foreclosure process had been handled through lawyers and banks, all very official and impersonal. As far as she knew, some faceless investment company had bought her house and would probably rent it out to college students or turn it into a halfway house. She'd been complaining about it for weeks. "Can you imagine?" she'd said the previous Sunday, passing around her famous cornbread that was really just a box mix with an extra egg. 30 years in that house and they sell it to some corporation. They probably don't even live in California. No consideration for the neighborhood, for property values, for what kind of people they might put in there. I'd made sympathetic noises while cutting my bulgogi into smaller pieces, trying to make it less threatening for the Williams family palate. "At least the senior living community is nice," Jessica had chimed in. "Golden Oaks has such beautiful gardens. And you won't have to worry about yard work anymore." Patricia had smiled tightly. Golden Oaks was nice, if you enjoyed living in a place that felt like a hotel crossed with a hospital. She'd moved there the week after losing the house, trading her wraparound porch and mature oak trees for a 1-bedroom apartment with a kitchenette and community dining room. "It's temporary," she'd said, which was what she'd been saying for 3 weeks. "I'm looking at other options." Other options that didn't exist, according to Rosa, who'd done her research. Patricia was 68 years old with a teacher's pension and Social Security. The house on Oak Avenue had been her biggest asset, and she'd leveraged it to pay for Jessica's college tuition and Michael's wedding. The mortgage payments had become unmanageable after her husband died 2 years earlier, but she'd been too proud to ask for help until it was too late. Now, standing in my kitchen with containers of Korean food and a secret that felt like a live wire in my chest, I realized I wasn't just making dinner. I was making a statement. Today was the day Patricia Williams learned that the woman she'd been trying to shrink for 3 years had grown large enough to own her world. Michael appeared beside me again, still jingling his keys. "Ready?" I looked at him, this man I'd married who still flinched every time his mother raised her voice, who still asked permission before expressing an opinion, who'd spent 4 years watching his wife get carved up every Sunday and had never once told his mother to stop. "Actually," I said, picking up the containers, "I think I am." The drive to Oak Avenue took 15 minutes, long enough for Michael to run through his usual pre-dinner checklist of warnings and suggestions. Maybe don't mention the cooking class I'd been thinking about taking. Maybe don't bring up the catering business idea again. Maybe just focus on Jessica's latest blog post. She'd been getting so much positive feedback. I'd stopped listening somewhere around his third maybe, and started thinking about my grandmother instead. About the way she'd taught me that cooking was an act of love, but also an act of power. The person who feeds the family controls the table. The person who controls the table controls the conversation. The person who controls the conversation controls the narrative. For 3 years, Patricia had controlled our narrative. Today, that was going to change. We pulled into the driveway of the house that I now owned, though the only sign of that was the key in my purse and the deed in my safety deposit box. From the outside, it looked exactly the same. Same manicured lawn, same seasonal wreaths on the front door, same sense of suburban perfection that had intimidated me the first time I'd seen it. Jessica's car was already there, which meant she'd arrived early to help Patricia with whatever elaborate spread she'd planned for today. Through the kitchen window, I could see the two of them moving around together, blonde heads bent over recipe cards and serving dishes. The picture of domestic harmony that I'd never quite been able to step into. "You okay?" Michael asked, noticing that I hadn't gotten out of the car yet. I was more than okay. I was ready. "Perfect," I said, grabbing my containers and my purse and the knowledge that I was about to serve the most interesting meal of my life. "Let's go have dinner." The front door opened before we could ring the bell, which was vintage Patricia. She had a sixth sense for timing that allowed her to appear at the exact moment when someone might need a few extra seconds to compose themselves. Today she was wearing a cream-colored cardigan over pressed slacks, her silver hair perfectly styled despite spending the morning cooking. She looked like she'd stepped out of a catalog for gracious living, which I suppose had always been the point. "There you are," she said, her smile bright and measured. Right on time, her eyes swept over my containers with the kind of polite interest reserved for distant relatives bearing questionable gifts. "Oh, you brought something. How thoughtful." Thoughtful, another Patricia word that meant the opposite of what it sounded like. I'd brought something to every Sunday dinner for 3 years, and it was always described as thoughtful, never as delicious or appreciated or welcome. "Sarah made her grandmother's seafood pancakes," Michael offered, already shifting into his role as translator between his wife and his mother. "And some of those lettuce wraps you liked that one time." I'd made the lettuce wraps exactly once, 8 months ago, and Patricia had spent the entire meal explaining to Jessica how difficult it was to eat food that required assembly. But Michael remembered them as something she'd liked, which was either optimistic or delusional. After 4 years of marriage, I still wasn't sure which. "Wonderful," Patricia said, stepping aside to let us enter. "Jessica's in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on her new recipe. She's so excited to share it with everyone." The house smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, the kind of safe, familiar scents that came from recipes printed on the backs of spice containers. I followed Patricia through the living room, past the family photos that chronicled 30 years of Williams' family history. Michael's graduation pictures, Jessica's dance recitals, family vacations to places like Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon. All American adventures captured in silver frames. There were exactly 3 photos that included me. Our engagement party, our wedding, and one awkward Christmas morning where I looked like I was interrupting a private family moment. Which, in retrospect, I probably was. "Sarah!" Jessica's voice rang out from the kitchen, high and bright and exactly as welcoming as her mother's. She appeared in the doorway wearing a vintage apron over a sundress, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun that had probably taken 20 minutes to achieve. "I'm so glad you're here. I've been dying to get your opinion on my new creation." Jessica's new creation turned out to be something she called Grandma's Secret Tuna Melts, which involved mixing canned tuna with cream cheese, dill, and what appeared to be an entire sleeve of crackers, then baking the mixture on white bread until it bubbled. She'd arranged them on a vintage platter and garnished each one with a single cherry tomato, clearly styled for photography. "I've already gotten 47 likes on the preview post," she said, pulling out her phone to show me the Instagram story. "Look at these comments. Looks amazing. Can't wait for the recipe. You're so creative. I'm thinking this might be my signature dish." I looked at the tuna melts, then at Jessica's expectant face, then at Patricia hovering nearby with the expression of someone watching her favorite child receive the praise she deserved. The smart thing would have been to say something encouraging. The diplomatic thing would have been to ask for the recipe. The Sarah who had been attending Sunday dinners for 3 years thing would have been to smile and nod and take a small bite while making appreciative sounds. But I wasn't that Sarah anymore. That Sarah hadn't owned property. That Sarah hadn't spent the last 3 weeks walking through her new house, measuring rooms and imagining renovations. That Sarah hadn't stood in the master bedroom where Patricia had slept for 28 years and felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd never have to ask permission to belong somewhere again. "They look very creative," I said, which was true. It took creativity to turn perfectly good tuna into something that resembled cat food casserole. Jessica beamed, apparently missing the subtle distinction between creative and good. "I know, right? I was thinking about doing a whole series on elevated classics, taking traditional recipes and giving them a modern twist. Like fusion food," I said helpfully. The temperature in the kitchen dropped about 10 degrees. Patricia's smile became fixed, the kind of expression that appeared when someone had said exactly the wrong thing. Michael shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a nervous habit I'd learned to recognize as his early warning system. "Not fusion exactly," Jessica said quickly, glancing at her mother. "More like refined comfort food. You know, taking the recipes our grandmothers made and presenting them in a more sophisticated way." "Of course," I said. "Much more sophisticated than actual fusion cuisine." If Patricia had been a cartoon character, steam would have been coming out of her ears. Instead, she just smiled wider and suggested we move to the dining room so we could all sit down and enjoy our meal together like a proper family. The dining room table was set with Patricia's good china, the kind with tiny roses around the edges that she'd inherited from her own mother. She'd arranged Jessica's tuna melts on the center platter, like they were delicate canapes instead of processed fish on Wonder Bread. My containers sat at the far end of the table, unopened and slightly quarantined from the rest of the meal. "Should I serve everyone?" Jessica offered, already reaching for the serving spoon. "Let Sarah serve her dishes first," Patricia said graciously. "We wouldn't want them to get cold." This was Patricia's way of ensuring that whatever I'd brought would be tasted first, when everyone was least hungry, and compared directly to Jessica's carefully planned offerings. It was psychological warfare disguised as good manners, and I'd fallen for it every single time for 3 years. Except today, I wasn't falling for anything. "Actually," I said, setting my containers down and opening the first one, "I'd love to tell you about these recipes while I serve them. This one is my grandmother's seafood pancake. She taught me to make it when I was 10 years old." I began spooning the golden brown pancakes onto plates, the aroma of scallions and seafood filling the dining room. She used to say that food was a way of sharing your history with someone. Every ingredient has a story. Patricia accepted her plate with the kind of strained politeness usually reserved for door-to-door salespeople. "How interesting. What kind of seafood?" "Shrimp, squid, and scallops," I said, moving on to Michael's plate. "But the secret is in the batter. You have to let it rest for exactly 30 minutes, and you can't overmix it or the texture gets rubbery." I was explaining this to Jessica, who was watching with the kind of intense focus she usually reserved for her phone screen. The technique is actually quite similar to making crepes, but the flavor profile is completely different because of the dashi base. "Dashi?" Patricia's voice had taken on that particular tone that meant she was about to educate someone about something. "It's a Japanese soup stock," I explained, serving myself last. "My grandmother learned to make it during the war, when she was working in a restaurant in Los Angeles. She adapted a lot of recipes during that time, mixing Korean techniques with ingredients she could actually find." This was the part of the story I'd never told them before, the part about my grandmother working in a restaurant because her husband was fighting in Korea while she was pregnant with my mother. The part about learning to cook from Japanese and Chinese cooks because they were the only ones willing to teach a young Korean woman who barely spoke English. The part about survival and adaptation and making do with what you had. "How resourceful," Patricia said, cutting a small piece of pancake with surgical precision. "I suppose people had to be creative during wartime." She took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and I watched her face for some sign of what she was thinking. For 3 years, I'd been watching that face, trying to decode the micro-expressions that would tell me whether I'd succeeded or failed at being acceptable. "It's quite flavorful," she said finally, which in Patricia speak meant it was too spicy, too exotic, too much of whatever she'd been trying to train out of me since the day we met. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. Flavorful was actually a compliment, even if she hadn't intended it as one. Michael was eating with the kind of enthusiasm he usually reserved for baseball games and action movies. "This is really good, Sarah. The texture is amazing." "Mom used to make something similar," Jessica said, surprising me. "Remember those corn fritters she used to make for breakfast, with the little pieces of corn and the crispy edges?" For a moment, the table felt almost normal. Like we were a family sharing a meal instead of opponents in some elaborate game of cultural chess. I let myself imagine that maybe this could work, maybe we could find a way to appreciate each other's differences instead of just tolerating them. Then Patricia set down her fork and cleared her throat. "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said last week. About wanting to start a catering business." Her voice was measured, careful, the tone she used when she was about to deliver what she considered helpful advice. "I think it's wonderful that you want to pursue your interests, but you might want to consider your target market." Here we go, I thought. The advice portion of the evening, where Patricia explained why my dreams were impractical and my cultural background was a liability in the real world. "I mean, this type of food is quite specialized," she continued, gesturing vaguely at my pancakes. "You'd probably do well in certain neighborhoods, places with more diverse populations. But for mainstream catering, for weddings and corporate events, people expect more traditional options." "Traditional like tuna melts?" I asked, my voice perfectly pleasant. Michael kicked me under the table, a gentle warning that I was approaching dangerous territory. But I was past caring about dangerous territory. Dangerous territory was where interesting things happened. "Not tuna melts specifically," Patricia said, her smile becoming more forced. "But yes, traditional American cuisine. The kind of food that appeals to a broad audience. You have to think about what people are comfortable with." "What people are comfortable with," I repeated, tasting the words. "You mean what white people are comfortable with." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Michael had gone pale, Jessica was staring at her plate, and Patricia was looking at me like I'd just announced my intention to burn down the neighborhood. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Patricia said slowly, each word carefully enunciated. "I never said anything about race. I was simply suggesting that successful businesses understand their market demographics." "Of course," I said. "Demographics? Like how my food is too ethnic for family dinner, but Jessica's blog about traditional American recipes is getting featured in magazines." "Sarah?" Michael's voice was low, warning. "Maybe we should." "Should what?" I turned to look at my husband, this man who'd been mediating between his wife and his mother for 4 years without ever once taking a side. "Should pretend that your mother hasn't spent 3 years trying to convince me that everything about my culture is wrong for your family?" "That's not fair," Jessica interjected, her voice defensive. "Mom never said anything was wrong, she's just been trying to help you fit in." "Fit in?" The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a kitchen fire. Fit in by changing everything about myself. Fit in by abandoning the recipes my grandmother taught me. Fit in by becoming a pale imitation of the daughter-in-law Patricia had imagined for her son. Fit in where exactly? I asked. Into what? Patricia had recovered her composure, her teacher voice emerging like armor. "Sarah, I think you're being overly sensitive. No one has ever asked you to change who you are. We've simply tried to include you in our family traditions. Include me by excluding everything that makes me who I am. That's not true," Patricia said firmly. "You're part of this family. You married Michael, you're welcome at our table every Sunday. No one has ever suggested otherwise." She was right, technically. I was welcome at their table. Welcome to sit quietly while they celebrated Jessica's achievements. Welcome to listen while they planned family vacations I wasn't invited to join. Welcome to provide an audience for their performances of togetherness, while being carefully edited out of the actual family narrative. "You're right," I said, standing up from the table. "I am part of this family. In fact, I'm more part of this family than you realize. Patricia's eyebrows drew together in confusion. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, I said, reaching into my purse for the folder I'd been carrying around for 3 weeks, that I have something to tell you about your housing situation. I pulled out the deed and set it on the table next to Jessica's tuna melts. The legal language was dense and official, but the relevant information was highlighted in yellow. Property address, 1247 Oak Avenue. Owner, Sarah Chen Williams. The silence this time was different. Heavier. Patricia picked up the document with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the text like she was reading a foreign language. I don't understand, she said finally. This says you bought the house. 3 weeks ago, I confirmed. Cash offer. Closed escrow last Tuesday. Michael was staring at me like I'd just revealed I was an alien. Jessica's mouth was hanging open, her perfect composure finally cracking. Patricia was reading the deed over and over, as if the words might change if she looked at them long enough. You bought my house, Patricia repeated, her voice hollow. I bought a house that was in foreclosure, I corrected. A house that belonged to a bank because the previous owner couldn't make the payments. But why? Michael's voice was barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? I turned to look at my husband, this man who'd spent 4 years asking me to make myself smaller, so his family would be more comfortable. Because you would have tried to stop me. Because you would have said it was too expensive, or too complicated, or too something. Because you've spent our entire marriage asking me to consider everyone's feelings except my own. But I don't understand why you wanted it, Jessica said, her influencer voice completely gone, replaced by something raw and confused. It's just a house. It's not even in a good school district. It's not just a house, I said, looking directly at Patricia. It's the house where your son grew up. It's the house where you've lived for 30 years. It's the house where you've spent every Sunday for the past 3 years explaining to me why I don't belong in this family. Patricia's face had gone ashen. You bought it to spite me. I bought it because I could, I said simply. Because I had the money and the credit and the legal right to own property in this country. Because I'm tired of being grateful for scraps from your table when I can afford to buy the whole dining room. The clock in the hallway chimed 6:30. Outside, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn that I now owned. Inside, 3 people were staring at me like I'd just performed an impossible magic trick. What happens now? Patricia asked, her voice small. Now, I said, collecting my containers and putting the lids back on. You finish your dinner. You enjoy Jessica's tuna melts and tell her how creative she is. You sit in this dining room and pretend that nothing has changed. I stood up, my legs steadier than they'd been in years. And tomorrow, when you wake up in your temporary apartment at Golden Oaks, you'll remember that the woman you spent 3 years trying to shrink just became your landlord. I walked toward the front door, not waiting to see if Michael would follow. Behind me, I could hear Patricia's voice, high and strained, asking Jessica if she thought this was legal, if I could really do this, if there was some way to undo what had already been done. The front door closed behind me with a soft click, and I stood on the porch that I now owned, breathing the evening air that tasted like freedom and possibility, and the distant scent of jasmine from the garden I would soon replant with vegetables my grandmother would have recognized. My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Rosa. How did it go, Mija? I looked back at the house, at the warm light spilling from the windows where 3 people were probably having the most honest conversation they'd had in years. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't part of that conversation, and for the first time in 3 years, that felt exactly right. Perfect, I texted back. Absolutely perfect. The drive home was silent, except for the sound of Michael's breathing, which had taken on the shallow, controlled rhythm he used when he was trying not to have a panic attack. His hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality, knuckles white against the black leather. Every few seconds, he would glance at me like I was a stranger who had somehow replaced his wife during dinner. We'd been married for 4 years, together for 6, and I don't think he'd ever really seen me angry before. Not the kind of anger that comes from years of small cuts, each one barely noticeable until you realize you're bleeding from 1,000 tiny wounds. Not the kind of anger that builds quietly in the spaces between what you say and what you mean, between who you are and who you're expected to become. "Sarah," he said finally, as we pulled into our apartment complex. His voice was careful, measured, like he was talking to someone holding a loaded weapon. "We need to talk about what just happened." I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned to look at him, really look at him. Michael Williams at 34 was still handsome in the same safe, dependable way he'd been when we met. Sandy brown hair that never quite behaved. Green eyes that crinkled when he smiled. The kind of face that looked trustworthy in professional photos. He was the kind of man who remembered to put the toilet seat down and never left dishes in the sink, and always asked how my day was when he got home from work. He was also the kind of man who had watched his mother systematically dismantle his wife's confidence for 3 years, and had never once told her to stop. "What do you want to talk about, Michael?" I asked, pulling my keys from my purse. "About how I bought a house without asking your permission. About how I embarrassed your mother in front of your sister. About how I violated some unspoken rule of family harmony that I was never actually told about." He flinched at each question like I was slapping him. "About how you spent our savings without telling me. About how you bought my childhood home out from under my mother. About how you just declared war on my entire family. Our savings." The phrase hung between us like a challenge. We'd been married 4 years, but we still kept separate bank accounts because Michael said it was more modern that way, more independent. The down payment for the house had come entirely from my account, money I'd saved from my marketing job and the small inheritance my grandmother had left me. Money that was legally, completely, unquestionably mine. "Your entire family?" I repeated. "Michael, when was the last time your family included me in anything that mattered? When was the last time your mother asked my opinion about something other than whether I thought Jessica's latest recipe was creative enough?" We walked up the stairs to our second-floor apartment in silence. Michael fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking slightly. Inside, our living room looked exactly the same as it had that morning. But somehow, everything felt different. The beige walls that had once seemed neutral now looked lifeless. The rental furniture that had once seemed practical now looked temporary, like we were still waiting for our real life to begin. I sat down on our IKEA couch and waited for Michael to say whatever he'd been rehearsing during the drive home. He stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, running his hands through his hair in the way he did when he was overwhelmed. "My mother called while you were getting your purse," he said finally. "She's devastated, Sarah. She doesn't understand why you would do this." "She doesn't understand why I would do what exactly?" I asked. "Buy a house? Exercise my legal right to purchase property at a public auction? Invest in real estate in a good neighborhood? You know that's not what this is about." "Then what is it about, Michael? Because from where I'm sitting, this is about me making a smart financial decision, and your mother being upset that she doesn't get to control the narrative anymore." He sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in the pose he used when he was trying to be serious and reasonable. "Sarah, you bought my mother's house. The house where I grew up. The house where she's lived for 30 years. You bought it while she was losing it to foreclosure, and you didn't tell anyone you were doing it." I told Aunt Rosa. "Aunt Rosa isn't family." The words hit me like a physical blow. Aunt Rosa, who had held my hand during the auction. Aunt Rosa, who had helped me understand the paperwork and guided me through the inspection process. Aunt Rosa, who had listened to me cry about feeling invisible in my own marriage and had never once suggested that the solution was to make myself smaller. "Aunt Rosa isn't family," I repeated slowly. "But your mother is. Your mother, who spent dinner tonight explaining to me why my grandmother's recipes are too ethnic for your family table. Your mother, who has never once asked me about my job, my dreams, my opinions, or my feelings about anything that doesn't directly affect her son." "That's not fair," Michael said, his voice getting defensive. "Mom has been nothing but welcoming to you." "Welcoming?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Michael, your mother has spent 3 years trying to erase everything that makes me who I am. She criticizes my cooking, dismisses my culture, and treats me like I'm a phase you're going through instead of the woman you married. She's set in her ways, but she means well. She means well." I stood up, suddenly unable to sit still. "Do you know what she said to me at your cousin's wedding last year?" She said it was such a shame that we hadn't had children yet because she was worried about what they would look like. Michael's face went pale. She didn't say that. She absolutely said that. She said it while we were standing in the bathroom line, just the two of us. She said she hoped any grandchildren would favor your side of the family because it would be easier for them that way. Sarah, I think you might have misunderstood. I didn't misunderstand anything, Michael. Your mother is a racist. She's polite about it, she's subtle about it, but she's a racist who has spent 3 years making it clear that she considers me a mistake her son made. The word hung in the air between us like a confession. Racist. The word we'd never used, the truth we'd never acknowledged, the elephant in the room that had been growing larger with every Sunday dinner and every passive-aggressive comment and every time Patricia had praised Jessica's white bread cooking while dismissing mine. Mom is not a racist, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. She's just traditional. Traditional is a code word, Michael. Traditional means white. It means Christian. It means everything that I'm not. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. So what happens now? You bought her house to punish her? I bought her house because I could, I said again. Because I'm tired of being grateful for acceptance from people who fundamentally don't respect me. Because I'm tired of pretending that their tolerance is the same thing as love. And what about us? His voice was barely above a whisper. What happens to us? I looked at my husband, this man I'd loved for 6 years. This man who had never once defended me to his family. This man who was more concerned about his mother's hurt feelings than his wife's dignity. I don't know, Michael. What do you want to happen to us? I want things to go back to normal. Normal. I tasted the word like something bitter. Normal was me sitting at your mother's table every Sunday, pretending not to notice when she winced at my food. Normal was me smiling while your sister got praised for recipes that came off the back of soup cans, while my grandmother's 60-year-old techniques were dismissed as weird. Normal was me making myself smaller and smaller until I disappeared completely. That's not what was happening. That's exactly what was happening, Michael. And the worst part is that you helped them do it. Every time you told me to just ignore her comments. Every time you made excuses for her behavior. Every time you asked me to be the bigger person instead of asking your mother to be a decent human being. He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. So you decided to humiliate her instead? To take away the one thing she had left? I decided to stop being a victim, I said calmly. Your mother lost her house because she mortgaged it to pay for Jessica's college and couldn't make the payments after your father died. She lost it because she made financial decisions she couldn't afford. I didn't take anything from her. I bought something she had already lost. You could have told me. We could have helped her. With what money, Michael? You make $43,000 a year as a junior accountant. I make $38,000 in marketing. We don't have house-saving money. We barely have savings at all. We could have figured something out. We could have figured something out, I repeated. Like what? Like taking out a loan we couldn't afford to bail out your mother who never bothered to ask for help until it was too late? Like sacrificing our financial security for a woman who has made it clear that she considers me a burden on her family? Michael slumped back down on the couch, his head in his hands. I don't know, Sarah. I don't know what the right answer is anymore. The right answer, I said, sitting down next to him, is that your mother needed to face the consequences of her choices instead of expecting other people to fix her problems. The right answer is that I had every legal right to buy that house, and I did. But why didn't you tell me? I was quiet for a long moment, trying to find words for something I'd only just begun to understand myself. Because you would have talked me out of it. Because you would have said it was too much money, or too complicated, or too mean to your mother. Because for 4 years, every time I've wanted to do something for myself, you found a reason why I should consider everyone else's feelings first. That's not true. It is true, Michael. When I wanted to take that cooking class, you said it was too expensive. When I wanted to start a catering business, you said the market was too competitive. When I wanted to go back to school for my MBA, you said it would put too much strain on our relationship. Those were practical concerns. Those were excuses. And the practical concern wasn't about money or timing or market research. The practical concern was that I might become someone who couldn't be controlled. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a text message from a number I didn't recognize. I picked it up and read it, my heart sinking as I realized what was happening. "You need to see this," I said, handing Michael the phone. The message was short and to the point. "Saw the drama at dinner tonight. Your husband's family is posting about you on Facebook. Thought you should know. David Kim, neighbor." Michael read the message twice, his face growing pale. "Who is David Kim?" "I have no idea," I said, already opening Facebook on my phone. "But I have a feeling I'm about to find out what your family really thinks about tonight." It didn't take long to find Jessica's post. She'd shared it publicly, which meant anyone could see it, and she'd tagged both Michael and Patricia in it. The post was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive storytelling, complete with carefully chosen photos and enough vague details to let people draw their own conclusions. "Heartbroken tonight," the post began. "Sometimes the people closest to you show their true colors when you least expect it. Family is supposed to support each other through difficult times, not take advantage of someone when they're at their lowest point. Praying for healing and forgiveness during this difficult time. Love and light to everyone going through family struggles. #family, #heartbroken, #prayers. The post had been up for less than an hour and already had 47 likes and 23 comments. I scrolled through them, my stomach churning as I read the responses from friends and family members who had no idea what had actually happened, but were eager to offer support and sympathy. "So sorry you're going through this, Jess. Family drama is the worst. Sending love and prayers. You're such a strong person. Some people just can't handle other people's success. Stay positive. What happened? DM me if you need to talk." There were more, each one a small knife twisted in the wound of public humiliation. Jessica had managed to paint herself as the victim without actually saying what had happened, which meant people were free to imagine the worst possible version of events. "Michael," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Your sister just announced to the entire internet that I'm a terrible person who takes advantage of family members at their lowest point." He read over my shoulder, his breathing becoming shallow again. "She's upset, she's not thinking clearly. She's thinking very clearly. She's controlling the narrative before I have a chance to tell my side of the story. She's making sure that everyone in your family and friend group knows that I'm the villain before they hear any of the actual facts." I kept scrolling, and that's when I saw Patricia's comment, posted just minutes after Jessica's original post. "Thank you for your support, sweetheart. Some people mistake kindness for weakness. God will judge hearts and intentions. Love you so much." The comment had already been liked by a dozen people, including several relatives whose names I recognized from family gatherings. Patricia's church friends, Jessica's college roommates, Michael's high school buddies who barely knew me but were happy to pile on to the drama. "She's talking about me," I said, showing Michael the comment. "Your mother just told the entire internet that I mistake kindness for weakness and that God will judge my heart and intentions. Sarah, maybe we should just ignore this. Social media drama isn't real life. Social media drama becomes real life when it's about real people doing real things, Michael. Your sister just publicly accused me of taking advantage of your mother. Your mother just publicly questioned my character and my motivations. This isn't drama, this is character assassination." I stood up and walked to our bedroom, Michael trailing behind me. I pulled my laptop out from under the bed and opened it on the dresser, my fingers flying over the keyboard as I began typing. "What are you doing?" Michael asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "I'm writing my own post," I said without looking up. "I'm telling my side of the story before your family gets to write my entire narrative for me." "Sarah, please don't. This will just make things worse." "Worse for who?" I asked, turning to face him. "Worse for your mother, who just lost control of the story. Worse for your sister, who thought she could publicly shame me without consequences. Or worse for you, because you'll have to choose between your wife and your family." Michael sat down heavily on the edge of our bed. "I don't want to have to choose." "Then you should have thought about that 3 years ago, when your mother started her campaign to remake me in your sister's image. You should have thought about that every Sunday when you watched her tear me down and decided it was easier to ask me to endure it than to ask her to stop. I turned back to my laptop and continued typing. The post was simple, factual, and devastating in its directness. I explained that I had purchased a house at a public foreclosure auction. I explained that the house had belonged to my mother-in-law, who had been unable to make payments after her husband's death. I explained that I had used my own money, saved from my own job, to make a legal purchase at a public sale. Then I explained what had really happened at dinner. Not the emotion, not the years of accumulated resentment, just the facts. The comments about my cooking being too ethnic. The suggestion that my catering business should target diverse neighborhoods instead of mainstream markets. The decades of being made to feel like a guest in my own husband's family. I finished the post with a simple statement. I'm tired of being grateful for tolerance from people who mistake their prejudice for preference. I bought a house because I could afford to buy a house. I don't apologize for that. Sarah, please don't post that, Michael said, reading over my shoulder. It will destroy my family. Your family is destroying itself, I said, my finger hovering over the share button. I'm just refusing to be collateral damage anymore. If you post that, there's no going back. Everything changes. I looked at my husband, this man who was still more concerned about his family's reputation than his wife's dignity. Everything already changed, Michael. The question is whether I'm going to let them tell the story or whether I'm going to tell my own. I clicked share and closed the laptop. Within seconds, my phone started buzzing with notifications. Comments, likes, shares, private messages from people I'd never expected to hear from. The story was out of my hands now, spreading across social media like wildfire, beyond my control and beyond Patricia's ability to manage. What have you done? Michael whispered. I've told the truth, I said, walking back to the living room. For the first time in 4 years, I've told the complete, unvarnished truth about what it's like to be married into your family. My phone rang. Aunt Rosa's name appeared on the screen, and I answered without hesitation. Misha? Her voice was warm and proud. I just saw your post. Are you okay? I'm perfect, I said, and realized it was true. For the first time in years, I felt completely, entirely myself. I'm absolutely perfect. Good, Rosa said, because you're about to find out who your real friends are. And baby, you might be surprised by how many people have been waiting for someone to say what you just said. As if to prove her point, my laptop chimed with another notification. Then another. Comments were pouring in from people I'd never expected to hear from, sharing their own stories about in-laws and family pressure, and the exhaustion of trying to fit into spaces that were never designed for them. Michael was staring at his own phone, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. 27 people have shared your post already, he said quietly, including my cousin David, and my Aunt Helen, and 3 of my coworkers. Are you surprised? He looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something that might have been respect in his eyes. Yeah, he said softly. I am. The notifications kept coming. Stories, support, and something I hadn't expected. Validation from people who had been watching Patricia's behavior for years and had been too polite to say anything. Michael's own relatives, sharing stories about feeling judged or excluded or made to feel small at family gatherings. Coworkers and neighbors and friends who had witnessed the Sunday dinner dynamics and had been quietly horrified by what they saw. Sarah, Michael said, his voice strange. My cousin posted a comment. She says Mom made her boyfriend feel unwelcome because he was Puerto Rican. She says it's been going on for years. I wasn't surprised, but I was relieved. For 3 years, I'd wondered if I was being too sensitive, if I was imagining patterns that weren't really there. Now I knew the truth. I wasn't Patricia's only target. I was just the only one who'd been trapped at her table every Sunday for 3 years. What do you want to do now? I asked Michael. He was quiet for a long moment, reading through the comments on my post. I want to call my mother, he said finally. I want to ask her if what my cousin said is true. I want to ask her if she really said those things about our future children. I want to ask her why she thinks it's okay to treat my wife like she's not good enough for our family. And if she denies it, then I'll know she's lying, he said, meeting my eyes. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not going to assume that you're the one who's wrong. It was a small step, but it was something. After 4 years of marriage, and 3 years of Sunday dinners, and countless nights of me going to bed feeling like I was fighting a war no one else could see, my husband was finally ready to ask the right questions. My phone buzzed again. Another message from David Kim, the neighbor who'd warned me about the Facebook posts. "Saw your response," the text read. "Well done. By the way, I'm a paralegal. If you need help with anything related to the property purchase, let me know. What your in-laws are doing looks like harassment to me." I showed the text to Michael. "Looks like I'm not the only one who thinks your family crossed a line tonight." He read the message and sighed. "What do you want to do?" "I want to finish unpacking my new house," I said. "I want to plant a garden with vegetables my grandmother would recognize. I want to host Sunday dinners where everyone at the table is actually welcome. And I want you to decide whether you're going to be part of that life or whether you're going to keep trying to mediate between me and people who fundamentally don't respect me. That's not fair. They're my family. And I'm your wife," I said. "The question is whether you're going to start acting like it." Outside, the sun had completely set and our apartment felt smaller than ever. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't worried about Sunday dinner. For the first time in my marriage, I wasn't walking on eggshells around my husband's feelings. For the first time since I'd met Patricia Williams, I wasn't apologizing for taking up space in my own life. My phone buzzed one more time. A comment on my post from someone with a familiar name, Michael Williams. My heart stopped as I opened it, wondering if my husband was about to publicly defend his mother and throw me under the bus. Instead, I found 4 simple words. "I'm proud of you." It wasn't everything. It wasn't an apology for 4 years of enabling his mother's behavior. It wasn't a promise that things would be different going forward. But it was something. It was a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, a beginning felt like enough. 3 days after my Facebook post went viral, I was sitting in a coffee shop downtown, waiting for David Kim to arrive. The paralegal who'd reached out had turned out to be more than just a helpful neighbor. He was Patricia's next-door neighbor, the one who'd been watching the family dynamics play out across the fence line for the better part of 2 years. More importantly, he was someone who understood property law and had some disturbing insights about what Patricia and Jessica were planning next. The coffee shop was one of those aggressively trendy places with exposed brick walls and baristas who took their latte art seriously. I'd chosen it specifically because it was the kind of place Patricia would never set foot in, too hipster and too expensive for her sensibilities. I needed to think clearly, and that required being somewhere she couldn't accidentally appear with her concerned mother routine. My phone had been buzzing constantly since Monday night. The post had been shared over 300 times, generating comments from people I'd never met, who wanted to share their own stories about toxic in-laws and cultural prejudice disguised as family tradition. But mixed in with the support were messages that made my skin crawl. Screenshots of private Facebook groups where Patricia's church friends were dissecting my character. Comments on Jessica's blog from people who'd decided I was a gold-digging opportunist who'd manipulated their way into an innocent family. The most unsettling development was the GoFundMe campaign that had appeared Tuesday morning. Jessica had created it with the title, "Help Patricia Rebuild After Family Betrayal," complete with a photo of Patricia looking frail and displaced outside the Golden Oaks Senior Living Facility. The description painted me as a calculating predator who'd taken advantage of a grieving widow's financial struggles, buying her home out from under her during her darkest hour. The campaign had raised $4,000 in less than 48 hours. "Sarah Chen?" A voice interrupted my spiral of anxiety. I looked up to see a Korean-American man in his early 40s, wearing a pressed button-down shirt and carrying a leather messenger bag that screamed legal professional. David Kim had the kind of precise, analytical presence that came from years of dealing with people's messiest problems. "Thank you for meeting me," I said, gesturing for him to sit down. "I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure why you wanted to help a complete stranger with her family drama." David smiled as he settled into the chair across from me, pulling out a tablet and a small notebook. "Family drama is one thing. What's happening to you crosses several legal lines, and I've been documenting it from my side of the fence for months." He opened his tablet and showed me a series of photographs taken from his backyard. Patricia's house was clearly visible, along with what appeared to be several official-looking documents scattered across her patio table. I work from home most days, and my office window overlooks her backyard. Last week, I watched her and Jessica spend an entire afternoon with what looked like financial paperwork spread out everywhere. The photos were time-stamped from the Thursday before our disastrous dinner, showing Patricia and Jessica hunched over papers, pointing and gesturing like they were planning military strategy. In one photo, Jessica was clearly holding a phone, her mouth open mid-conversation. The interesting thing, David continued, scrolling to another photo, is that Jessica arrived with a briefcase and left without it. Whatever they were planning, it required legal documentation. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of legal documentation? That's what I was hoping you could help me figure out. He pulled out his notebook and flipped to a page covered in neat handwriting. Tell me about the timeline of your house purchase. When did you first learn about the foreclosure? When did you decide to bid? Who else knew about your plans? I walked him through the entire sequence of events, from Rosa's initial phone call to the auction itself. David took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and times, and who had access to what information. Here's what concerns me, he said, tapping his pen against the notebook. The foreclosure auction was public record, but the bidding process was competitive. Someone would have needed inside information to know exactly when and how to interfere with your purchase. Interfere how? There are several ways to challenge a foreclosure auction after the fact. You can claim the bidding wasn't conducted properly, that the winning bidder didn't have legal standing, or that there was fraud involved in the financing. Most of these challenges have to be filed within 30 days of the sale. My stomach dropped. And it's been exactly 3 weeks since I bought the house. 21 days, David confirmed, which means if they're planning to challenge your purchase, they need to act within the next 9 days. He scrolled to another photo on his tablet, this one showing Jessica's car parked in Patricia's driveway with a man in a suit getting out of the passenger side. This was taken yesterday morning. That's Robert Steinberg, a real estate attorney who specializes in foreclosure disputes. He was inside for over 2 hours. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. They're going to try to reverse the sale. It looks that way. The GoFundMe campaign is probably part of the strategy. If they can paint you as someone who took advantage of Patricia's grief and financial desperation, they might be able to argue that the sale was predatory, or that you had an unfair advantage. But I didn't have any advantage. I found out about the auction the same way anyone else could have. Rosa saw the public notice in the legal section of the newspaper. That's what we need to prove, David said. And we need to prove it quickly, before they file whatever challenge they're planning. He pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. I've been thinking about your situation since I sent that first text. This isn't just about property law anymore. What Jessica posted on social media, combined with the GoFundMe campaign, could constitute defamation. The way Patricia has been talking about you to the neighbors could be considered harassment. I picked up the card. It was his business information, but handwritten on the back was another name and phone number. Elena Vasquez, attorney at law. She specializes in discrimination cases and family law. I think you should talk to her. You think I need a lawyer? I think you need someone who understands that this isn't really about a house, David said gently. This is about a family that spent 3 years trying to control you, and now they're escalating because you've shown them they can't. My phone buzzed with another notification. The GoFundMe campaign had hit $6,000, and Jessica had posted an update with more photos of Patricia looking displaced and heartbroken. The comments section was full of people expressing outrage about my heartless behavior and promising to share the campaign with their own networks. They're not just trying to get the house back, I realized, scrolling through the comments. They're trying to destroy my reputation so completely that even if I keep the house, I'll be too humiliated to live in it. Exactly. David closed his tablet and leaned forward. Sarah, I've been watching your in-laws for 2 years. I've seen how they treat service workers, delivery drivers, anyone they consider beneath their social status. What they're doing to you isn't new behavior. It's just the first time they've done it to someone who had the resources to fight back. What do you mean? I mean, Patricia Williams has been making life difficult for people in this neighborhood for years. She's reported 3 different families to the HOA for having, quote, inappropriate decorations or landscaping. She complained to the city about the Martinez family's quinceañera party, claiming it was too loud and too late, even though it ended at 9 p.m. on a Saturday. She's called the police on teenagers for loitering when they were waiting for the school bus. David pulled out his phone and showed me a group text thread. This is the neighborhood chat. Look at what people have been saying since your story came out. The messages were eye-opening. Neighbors sharing their own experiences with Patricia's passive-aggressive complaints and thinly veiled prejudice. Stories about feeling unwelcome at community events, being excluded from neighborhood social groups, or receiving anonymous complaints about their homes or families. Mrs. Chen, one message read, "Thank you for saying what we've all been thinking. The Williams family has made this neighborhood less welcoming for anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of, quote, appropriate." Another, "I'm Latino, and I've lived here for 8 years. Patricia Williams has never once spoken to me except to complain about something. I thought it was just me." "This is bigger than just our family conflict," I said, scrolling through dozens of similar messages. "Much bigger," David agreed. "And that's why Elena Vasquez wants to talk to you. She's been looking for a case like this, where the pattern of discrimination is clear and well documented." I looked up from the phone, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what was unfolding. I just wanted to buy a house. I didn't want to become the poster child for standing up to racist in-laws. "Sometimes we don't get to choose when we become the person who says enough," David said softly. "But you did say it, and now you get to decide what happens next." A new notification popped up on my phone. Michael's name appeared with a text that made my heart race. "Mom and Jessica are at the lawyer's office right now. Dad told me. They're filing something against you today. Call me." I showed the message to David, who immediately started typing on his phone. "I'm calling Elena right now. We need to get ahead of whatever they're filing." While David made his call, I stared out the coffee shop window at the busy street beyond. 3 days ago, my biggest worry was surviving another Sunday dinner without losing my temper. Now I was potentially facing a legal battle that could determine not just whether I kept my house, but whether I'd be able to show my face in my own neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia had spent 3 years trying to make me invisible, to erase everything about me that didn't fit her vision of the perfect daughter-in-law. Now her efforts to destroy me had made me more visible than I'd ever been. The Facebook post had connected me with people I'd never met who were cheering for my success. The GoFundMe campaign, intended to paint me as a villain, had backfired by inspiring other people to share their own stories about standing up to family bullies. "Elena can see you in an hour," David said, ending his call. "Her office is downtown, about 10 minutes from here. She's already started researching foreclosure challenge procedures, and she wants to see all the documentation from your purchase." "What do you think they're claiming?" "Probably that you had insider information about Patricia's financial situation, or that you manipulated the auction process somehow. The fact that you're married to Patricia's son gives them an angle to argue that the sale wasn't conducted at arm's length." My phone rang before I could respond. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a sense of dread. "Sarah, where are you?" His voice was strained, urgent. "Mom's lawyer wants to meet with both of us this afternoon. He says if we can work something out privately, they won't have to file a formal challenge." "Work what out exactly?" "He wants us to agree to sell the house back to Mom for what you paid for it. He says that would show good faith and resolve everything amicably." I looked at David, who was listening intently to my side of the conversation. He shook his head firmly and mouthed the word trap. "Michael, I'm not selling the house back." "Why not? You'd get all your money back and this whole nightmare would be over." "This whole nightmare would be over for your mother," I corrected. "For me, it would just be the beginning of a lifetime of knowing that your family can manipulate me into giving up anything I earn or achieve that they don't approve of." "That's not what this is about." "That's exactly what this is about." I stood up from the table, suddenly needing to move. "Your mother lost her house because she couldn't afford the payments. I bought it legally at a public auction. Now she wants me to undo that purchase because it's inconvenient for her narrative." "Sarah, please. The lawyer says they have grounds to challenge the sale. He says it could get really messy if it goes to court." "Let it get messy," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I'm done making my life smaller so your family can feel more comfortable. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm not meeting with your mother's lawyer. It means I'm getting my own lawyer. And it means you need to decide whether you're going to support your wife or whether you're going to keep being your mother's emotional support system. You're asking me to choose between you and my family. I'm asking you to choose between right and wrong, Michael. I'm asking you to choose between supporting someone who worked and saved and made a legal purchase, or supporting people who are trying to manipulate the legal system because they don't like the outcome. There was a long pause. I don't know what's happened to you, Sarah. You've changed. I've stopped apologizing for existing, I said. If that seems like a change to you, then maybe you should think about what that says about our marriage. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline. David was watching me with something that might have been admiration. Feel better? He asked. Terrified, but better, I admitted. Good. Terror means you're taking this seriously. He gathered his papers and stood up. Let's go see Elena. It's time to find out exactly what legal weapons your in-laws think they have, and what we can do to disarm them. Elena Vasquez's office was in a sleek building downtown, the kind of place that screamed successful attorney without being ostentatious about it. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and abstract art on the walls, clearly designed to make clients feel confident about their legal representation. Elena herself was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and the kind of sharp, intelligent eyes that suggested she didn't miss much. She greeted David like an old friend and shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who'd spent years proving herself in male-dominated courtrooms. David filled me in on the basics, she said, leading us into her office. But I want to hear your version of events, start to finish. I told her everything. The 3 years of Sunday dinners, the cultural criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions, the pattern of favoritism toward Jessica, and finally, the house purchase and its aftermath. Elena took notes throughout, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting specific dates and details. The GoFundMe campaign is interesting, she said when I'd finished. Can you show me the exact language they used? I pulled up Jessica's fundraising page on my phone and handed it over. Elena read through it carefully, her expression growing more serious with each paragraph. This could be considered defamatory, she said finally. They're making specific claims about your motivations and character that aren't supported by facts. They're also soliciting money based on a narrative that portrays you as predatory, which could constitute fraud if they know the claims are false. Can we stop them from raising money? We can try. We can also document everything they're saying and use it as evidence if they follow through on their legal challenge. Elena turned to her computer and started typing. David mentioned that they hired Robert Steinberg. I know Bob. He's competent, but not particularly creative. If they're planning to challenge your purchase, it'll be one of 3 standard approaches. She pulled up what appeared to be a legal database and scrolled through several case files. Option 1. They claim you had insider information that gave you an unfair advantage in the bidding. Option 2. They argue that your family relationship created a conflict of interest that invalidated the sale. Option 3. They claim the auction wasn't conducted properly. How strong are those arguments? Weak to non-existent. Based on what you've told me, you learned about the auction through public records. The bidding was conducted by the county. And your family relationship doesn't create any legal impediment to purchasing property at a public sale. Elena leaned back in her chair. The real question is whether they know how weak their legal position is, or whether they're counting on you being too intimidated to fight back. What do you think? I think they're counting on intimidation. They're hoping that the social media campaign, combined with the threat of legal action, will pressure you into giving up voluntarily. She turned to face me directly. The question is, how far are you willing to go to keep this house? I thought about that question for a long moment. Was the house itself worth a protracted legal battle? Worth potentially destroying what was left of my relationship with Michael? Worth becoming a public figure in a discrimination case that could follow me for years? Then I thought about my grandmother, standing in her tiny kitchen, teaching me to make seafood pancakes, about the pride in her voice when she told me that food was love, that sharing your culture was sharing your heart, about the way she'd survived war and displacement and discrimination, never once apologizing for who she was or where she came from. "All the way," I said finally. "I'm willing to go all the way." Elena smiled, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like I had an ally who understood what was really at stake. "Good," she said, turning back to her computer. "Because I think we're going to win. And when we do, your in-laws are going to learn that there are consequences for trying to weaponize the legal system against someone who did nothing wrong." My phone buzzed with another text from Michael. The lawyer filed the challenge. "It's official now. Mom wants to know if you've changed your mind about meeting." I showed the message to Elena, who was already pulling up court filing websites. "Let me see what they actually filed," she said, her fingers flying over the keyboard, "and then we'll draft our response. David, I'm going to need those photos you took, plus any other documentation you have about the Williams family's behavior toward their neighbors." "I've got 2 years' worth of HOA complaints and neighbor testimonials ready to go," David said, pulling out his phone. "When do you want them?" "Now," Elena said, "because based on what they just filed, this isn't going to be a simple property dispute anymore. They've opened the door to a much larger conversation about discriminatory behavior and abuse of legal process." She turned back to me with a grin that was part excitement, part anticipation. "Sarah, I hope you're ready to become famous, because by the time we're done with this case, your in-laws are gonna wish they'd never heard your name." For the first time in 3 days, I smiled back. Let them come, I thought. Let them bring their lawyers and their social media campaigns and their years of accumulated resentment. I had something they'd never counted on, the absolute certainty that I was right, and the resources to prove it. The war was officially beginning, and I was finally ready to fight. 6 weeks later, I stood in the kitchen of my house on Oak Avenue, preparing for what would be my first Sunday dinner as the official, legal, undisputed owner of the property. The court hearing had concluded 3 days earlier, with a decisive victory that left Patricia's legal team scrambling to explain to their client why her challenge had not only failed spectacularly, but had opened her up to a countersuit for harassment and defamation. The transformation of the house had been swift and intentional. Gone were Patricia's beige walls and safe, neutral decorating choices. In their place, I'd painted warm colors that reflected my heritage and my personality. The dining room was now a rich golden yellow that reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen. The living room featured deep red accents and artwork I'd collected over the years, but never felt confident enough to display in our rental apartment. Most importantly, the kitchen had been completely renovated to accommodate the kind of cooking I'd been hiding for 3 years. Professional-grade range, ample counter space, and a spice cabinet that would have given Patricia heart palpitations. The refrigerator was stocked with ingredients she'd never heard of, and the pantry contained enough Asian staples to supply a small restaurant. Today's dinner would be attended by 8 people, none of whom were named Williams. Aunt Rosa was bringing her famous trellis cheesecake. David Kim and his partner were contributing homemade kimchi and Korean fried chicken. Elena Vasquez was coming with her wife and their teenage daughter, bringing what she described as her mother's secret mole recipe. The Martinez family from down the street, the ones Patricia had complained about for years, were bringing their quinceañera caterers specialty tacos. It was going to be the kind of multicultural feast that would have sent Patricia running for her antacids, and I couldn't have been more excited. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. And I opened it to find Rosa standing on the porch with her arms full of flowers and a grin that could have powered the neighborhood. "Mija," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like vanilla and determination, "this house looks amazing. Your grandmother would be so proud." She wasn't wrong. The front porch now featured planters full of herbs I actually used in cooking, and the front door was painted a cheerful red that announced this was a home where people were welcome to be themselves. The pristine, museum-like quality Patricia had cultivated was gone, replaced by something that felt lived in and loved. "Come see the kitchen," I said, leading her inside. "I finally have room for all my equipment." Rosa whistled low as we entered the renovated space. "This is a serious kitchen, Sarah. You could run a catering business out of here." "That's the plan," I said, and realized I meant it. The legal victory had given me more than just the right to keep my house. It had given me permission to stop hiding my ambitions behind other people's comfort zones. The case itself had unfolded exactly as Elena had predicted. Patricia's legal challenge had been built on a foundation of assumptions and entitlement rather than actual law. Her attorneys had argued that my purchase of the house constituted a conflict of interest because of my family relationship, that I'd had access to insider information about the foreclosure timeline, and that the emotional distress caused by my purchase made the sale unconscionable. Judge Martinez had listened to 2 days of testimony, with the kind of patience that comes from years of dealing with frivolous lawsuits. Patricia had taken the stand to describe her shock and devastation at losing her family home to someone she'd trusted. Jessica had testified about the psychological impact of watching her mother be victimized by a family member. Even Michael had been called to testify about whether I'd had access to information that other bidders didn't possess. But Elena had been thorough in her preparation. She'd presented documentation showing that the foreclosure notice had been published in the legal section of 3 different newspapers for 6 weeks before the auction. She'd called witnesses who testified that Patricia had been receiving notices from her mortgage company for over a year before the foreclosure proceedings began. Most damaging of all, she'd presented evidence that Patricia had rejected multiple offers of financial assistance from family members, including a loan offer from Michael's uncle, that could have prevented the foreclosure entirely. The plaintiff, Judge Martinez had said in his final ruling, appears to believe that her family relationship with the defendant should have prevented the defendant from participating in a public auction. This court finds no legal basis for such a restriction. Property auctions are open to all qualified bidders, regardless of their personal relationships with previous owners. But the real turning point had come when Elena presented David Kim's evidence about Patricia's pattern of discriminatory behavior toward her neighbors. The judge had allowed the testimony after Elena argued that it was relevant to Patricia's credibility as a witness and her claims about my motivations. David had testified about 2 years of documented complaints, harassment, and exclusionary behavior. The Martinez family had described feeling unwelcome in their own neighborhood due to Patricia's constant complaints about their music, their guests, and their holiday celebrations. 3 other neighbors had testified about similar experiences with Patricia's passive-aggressive attempts to force them to conform to her vision of appropriate suburban behavior. The judge had been particularly interested in the GoFundMe campaign and Jessica's social media posts. Elena had argued that these constituted defamation and harassment, and had presented evidence that the fundraising descriptions contained false statements about my motivations and conduct. This court, Judge Martinez had concluded, finds that the plaintiff's challenge to the property sale is without merit and appears to be motivated by personal animus rather than legitimate legal concerns. Furthermore, the court finds that the defendant's conduct following the sale, including the social media campaign and fundraising efforts, constitutes harassment of the purchaser. He'd not only dismissed Patricia's challenge, but had ordered her to pay my legal fees and issue a public retraction of the false statements made in the GoFundMe campaign. Jessica had been forced to take down her blog posts about the situation and issue her own public apology. The financial penalty had been significant enough to require Patricia to liquidate some of her remaining assets, and the public nature of the ruling had made local news. The story had been picked up by several discrimination advocacy groups as an example of how legal systems could be used to validate prejudice, and how important it was for targets of such behavior to fight back. Now, 6 weeks later, I was hosting my first dinner party in the house that was unquestionably, legally, completely mine. "Sarah!" Elena's voice called from the front door. "We brought reinforcements." I walked to the living room to find Elena, her wife Carmen, and their daughter Sophia standing in the entryway with what appeared to be enough food for twice as many people. Carmen was carrying a large pot that smelled like heaven, and Sophia was balancing a tray of what looked like homemade tortillas. "We may have gotten a little carried away with the cooking," Carmen admitted, following me toward the kitchen. "But Elena told us about your spice collection, and we couldn't resist making our family's full traditional meal." Sophia, who was 15 and had inherited her mother's sharp eyes and direct manner, was already examining my renovated kitchen with obvious approval. "This is sick," she said, running her hand along the granite countertops. "You could totally film cooking videos in here." "That's actually not a terrible idea," Elena said, setting down her purse and immediately making herself at home. "You know there's a market for authentic cultural cooking content, especially after everything that happened with your case." The doorbell rang again, and this time it was David and his partner James, both carrying enough Korean food to feed a small army. James was a chef at a downtown restaurant and had apparently decided that this dinner was an opportunity to show off his skills. "We brought bulgogi, kimchi, japchae, and about 6 different banchan," David announced, heading straight for the kitchen. James insisted on making everything from scratch. "I wanted to make sure your first dinner party in this house was memorable," James said, starting to unpack containers with the efficiency of someone accustomed to professional food service. "David told me about what you went through, and I have some experience with family members who think Korean food is too weird for proper dinners." The Martinez family arrived last, with teenage children in tow and enough tacos to feed the entire neighborhood. Mrs. Martinez embraced me like we'd been friends for years, which in a way, we had been. She'd been one of the neighbors who'd testified about Patricia's harassment, and our shared experience of being made to feel unwelcome in our own neighborhood had created an instant bond. "This is how Sunday dinner should be," she said, looking around at the controlled chaos of 8 people arranging food in my kitchen, with people who actually want to be here, eating food that means something to them. As we settled around the dining room table, I realized this was the first meal I'd shared in this house where I wasn't walking on eggshells or monitoring every word for potential offense. The conversation flowed naturally between English, Spanish, and Korean, with people switching languages to better express themselves, or to include someone who might be more comfortable with a different linguistic rhythm. Rosa raised her glass of wine and called for a toast. "To Sarah," she said, "for showing all of us what it looks like to stop apologizing for taking up space." "To Sarah," Elena added, "for proving that sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to call their bluff in a court of law." "To Sarah," David said, "for making this neighborhood a more welcoming place for all of us." The toasts continued around the table, each person sharing something they'd learned from watching my situation unfold. Sophia talked about how my case had sparked discussions in her high school about cultural respect and family dynamics. James described how my story had inspired him to be more open about his own experiences with discrimination in professional kitchens. Mrs. Martinez talked about feeling empowered to speak up when she witnessed other families being marginalized in community settings. "You know what the best part is?" Carmen said, pausing between bites of David's bulgogi. "You didn't just win the legal case. You changed the entire dynamic of this neighborhood. Patricia Williams doesn't control the social narrative here anymore." It was true. In the weeks following the court ruling, several neighbors had shared their own stories about feeling excluded or judged by Patricia's version of community standards. The neighborhood had organized its first ever multicultural potluck, featuring foods and traditions from the dozen different ethnic backgrounds represented on our small stretch of suburban streets. The event had been hosted in my backyard, with Patricia's former rose garden providing the backdrop for a celebration that would have horrified her. "What's Michael's situation these days?" Rosa asked gently. She'd been carefully avoiding the topic of my marriage, but I could tell the question had been weighing on her. "Michael's figuring things out," I said, which was the most diplomatic way to describe the complicated process of a 34-year-old man learning to have opinions that differed from his mother's. "He's been staying with his uncle while he decides what he wants his life to look like going forward." The truth was more complicated. Michael had been genuinely shocked by the revelations that came out during the court case. Hearing neighbor after neighbor testify about his mother's discriminatory behavior had forced him to confront patterns he'd been trained to ignore his entire life. The testimony about Patricia's comments regarding our future children had been particularly devastating for him to hear in a public forum. "I never realized," he'd said to me after the second day of testimony. "I knew she could be difficult, but I never realized she was actively trying to hurt you." "She wasn't trying to hurt me," I'd corrected him. "She was trying to erase me." There's a difference. Michael had asked if he could attend tonight's dinner, and I'd told him he was welcome if he wanted to come. But I'd also made it clear that our marriage couldn't continue the way it had been, with him serving as a buffer between me and his family's dysfunction. If he wanted to rebuild our relationship, it would have to be as a partner who could stand up for what was right, not as a mediator trying to keep everyone comfortable. He'd chosen not to come tonight, saying he needed more time to process everything that had happened. I respected that choice, even as I recognized that it probably meant our marriage was heading toward an end. "You know," Elena said, helping herself to more of Mrs. Martinez's mole, "this case is going to be studied in law schools." The way Patricia tried to weaponize the legal system to enforce social conformity, and the way we documented the broader pattern of discriminatory behavior, it's going to be used as an example of how to fight back against institutional microaggressions. I never thought I'd become a case study, I admitted. The best case studies usually involve people who were just trying to live their lives, Elena said. Social change rarely comes from people who set out to be activists. It comes from people who reach a point where they refuse to accept unacceptable treatment. Sophia looked up from her phone, where she'd been scrolling through something. "You're actually kind of famous now," she said, turning the screen to show me. "Someone made a TikTok about your story, and it has like 500,000 views." I looked at the video, which was a dramatic retelling of my house purchase set to inspirational music. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive, with people sharing their own stories about standing up to family members who'd tried to control or diminish them. "I'm not sure how I feel about being TikTok famous," I said, handing the phone back. "Feel good about it," David said firmly. "Do you know how many people have reached out to me since your story went public? People who've been dealing with similar family dynamics and didn't know they had legal options? People who've been accepting discriminatory treatment because they thought that was just how families worked?" James nodded enthusiastically. "I've gotten messages from 3 different people asking for advice about dealing with racist in-laws. Your story gave them permission to stop making excuses for people who were treating them badly." As the evening wound down and people began to leave, each taking containers of leftovers that would ensure excellent lunches for the rest of the week, I found myself standing in my kitchen, surveying the beautiful chaos of a meal shared among people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The last to leave were Rosa and Elena, who stayed to help with cleanup and to discuss some exciting developments in my professional life. The media attention from the court case had generated several inquiries about catering services, and Elena had connected me with a small business lawyer who specialized in helping women launch food service companies. "You could have a full catering business running within 6 months," Rosa said, drying the last of the serving dishes. "You've got the kitchen, you've got the skills, and now you've got the name recognition. Plus," Elena added, "there's a real market for someone who can provide authentic cultural cuisine without exoticizing it or watering it down for mainstream Pilates. What you served tonight was restaurant-quality food that honored its traditional roots while being completely accessible to people from different backgrounds." After they left, I walked through my empty house, turning off lights and enjoying the satisfied quiet that comes after a successful gathering. In the dining room, I paused at the window that overlooked the street. Patricia's old view, the one she'd used to monitor neighborhood activities and judge whether people were meeting her standards of appropriate behavior. From this window, I could see the Martinez family's house, where the porch light illuminated colorful decorations that had once offended Patricia's aesthetic sensibilities. I could see David and James's house, with its small but meticulously maintained garden that mixed Korean vegetables with native California plants. I could see the Johnson family's house, where Mrs. Johnson had recently started parking her food truck in the driveway, much to Patricia's historical horror. This was my neighborhood now. Not because I'd conquered it or claimed it through conflict, but because I'd chosen to belong here authentically and had found that authentic belonging was contagious. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For a moment, I worried it might be another attempt at harassment from Jessica or one of Patricia's supporters. Instead, I found a message that made me smile. "Hi Sarah, this is Jennifer Wong from the Food Network. We're developing a new show about home cooks who are preserving and sharing cultural food traditions. Your story caught our attention, and we'd love to talk to you about a potential feature. Would you be interested in a conversation?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then walked to my grandmother's photo on the mantelpiece. She was smiling in the picture, wearing her favorite apron and holding a wooden spoon like a conductor's baton. "Food is love, Sarah, yeah?" I could hear her voice saying. "When you feed someone, you give them a piece of your heart." For 3 years, I'd been apologizing for my heart, trying to make it smaller and more palatable for people who couldn't appreciate its full size and flavor. Now I had a house big enough for my heart, a kitchen equipped to share it, and a community of people who understood that love comes in many different languages, but always tastes like home. I typed back a simple response. I'd love to talk. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its Sunday evening quiet. Inside, I began planning a menu that would introduce a television audience to the flavors my grandmother had taught me to love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and probably new attempts from people who preferred their world smaller and more controlled. But tonight I was Sarah Chen, homeowner, chef, and victor, in a battle I'd never planned to fight but had won decisively. Tonight, I was exactly who I'd always been, in a space that finally had room for all of me. And that felt like the perfect place to begin whatever came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.